On a muggy Monday morning in September, Jasmine King walked through the front doors of St. Clair High School with her shoulders straight, her head held high, and a new notebook tucked under her arm. She had just moved with her father to that small town after years of living in capital cities where anonymity was the rule and prejudice, although present, knew how to disguise itself better. Jasmine was 17 years old and had an impeccable academic record, the kind that fills a report card, with A's and comments like extremely dedicated. It was her first day at that school, known for its impeccably white walls, the trophies lined up in the central hallway, and the proud display of the label benchmark in academic excellence. From the outside, everything seemed perfect. Inside, she didn't know it yet, but some cracks were about to open. Before continuing, please like the video to support this type of content that brings real and important stories like Jasmine's. In room 202, where advanced literature classes were held, Jasmine was greeted by looks that measured more than her new uniform and organized notebooks. There was something in the eyes of some of her classmates, a mix of curiosity and silent judgment, that betrayed the novelty she represented there. In the center of the room, with her arms crossed and a face as rigid as stone, stood Miss Roberts. She was known as one of the oldest and most respected professors in the institution, the kind who made a point of reminding everyone that they were there to shape brilliant minds. Her thick-rimmed glasses and her always-shine shoes were almost as famous as her tone of voice that cut through the room like a razor. When she saw Jasmine, her eyes wavered for a split second, but her expression soon returned to professional neutrality, the same one that many used as a shield to hide what they really thought. Jasmine sat in the third row, near the window. She chose this seat because she liked the natural light hitting her notebooks and the ability to look outside when the atmosphere got too overwhelming, which she knew from experience often happened in new schools. The class began without much introduction, with Miss Roberts writing on the board the name of the book they would be discussing throughout the month, To Kill a Mockingbird. Jasmine smiled when she saw the title. She had read the book twice and felt deeply connected to the story. She couldn't wait to contribute to the discussions, especially because she believed she would have a lot to add to the conversation about racism, justice, and empathy. But as soon as she raised her hand to comment on the first passage, Miss Roberts simply ignored her. She didn't look. She didn't acknowledge it. She moved on to another student as if Jasmine's hand were invisible. For the first few minutes, Jasmine thought it was just a distraction. Maybe the teacher hadn't noticed. But as the class progressed, it became clear that it wasn't an oversight. Every time she raised her hand, Miss Roberts looked away. When she was finally called upon, after a classmate insisted, "I think Jasmine wanted to speak, miss," the teacher interrupted her in the third paragraph with a curt comment. "Let's try to keep the focus on literary analysis, not personal experiences, okay?" The silence that followed was uncomfortable. Some students looked away, others seemed to have no idea what was going on. But Jasmine understood. This wasn't about the content of her speech. It was about where she was speaking from. And to Miss Roberts, that place seemed to bother her more than any argument that could be made. In the following days, the same dynamic repeated itself with slight variations, but always with the same goal: silencing. Jasmine continued to participate, despite her growing discomfort. She formulated her ideas well, quoted passages from the book accurately, and made relevant connections with other authors. And yet, Miss Roberts always found a way to disqualify her speech. It lacked clarity. That's a shallow interpretation. Be careful with emotion in the analysis. Everything was said in a polite, technical, impeccably professional tone. Jasmine began to notice that there was a pattern. Students who said similar things, sometimes even less elaborate, received praise or, at the very least, neutral comments. With her, the feedback came loaded with unattainable demands, as if there were an exclusive ruler to measure her words. Despite the discomfort, Jasmine did not tell her father. She did not want to seem weak or give the impression that she was not ready for that challenge. Since she was little, she had learned not to lower her head. She knew that the world outside would be more difficult than any classroom and that attacks would not always come with shouting or direct insults. Sometimes violence came disguised as demands, as lack of preparation, as academic rigor. Inside, she felt her body stiffen a little more with each class. She began to review the text she wrote even more, to rehearse speeches in her mind before raising her hand, to doubt every idea she had. And even so, she stood her ground. Because something inside her, perhaps an ancient instinct, inherited from so many generations before her, told her that silence was not an option. That if she gave up her own voice there, in that space that promised to form critical minds, the silence would become definitive in much larger places. The final presentation on To Kill a Mockingbird was the most anticipated moment of that unit. Each student had to prepare a critical analysis of the book and present it orally, with slides and additional references. Jasmine knew that this would be the ultimate test. She dedicated hours to structuring the content, choosing striking phrases from the book, and looking for authors like Maya Angelou and Chimamanda to reinforce her ideas. She wanted to show that she understood the topic, that she had mastered it, that she was up to the task in that environment, not to prove anything to others, but to remind herself that she herself still believed in the value of her voice. In the hallways, she heard classmates commenting that the anticipation for her speech was high. Some said with genuine excitement, others with that biased tone that mixes surprise and doubt. Jasmine is going to talk about racism, right? It's going to be intense. The night before the presentation, Jasmine barely slept. She rethought every part, every slide, every transition. The fear of being interrupted or delegitimized again was in her head. But there was also a glimmer of hope. Perhaps in front of everyone, Miss Roberts would feel forced to remain neutral. Deep down, Jasmine still wanted to believe that the school environment, no matter how hostile it seemed, was still capable of recognizing merit when it was evident. When the bell rang and the students began to enter the room, she was already ready. Her hands were sweating, but her gaze was steady. Miss Roberts began the class as usual, impersonal, direct, without affection. She announced that there would be 3 presentations that day and called for the first one. Jasmine would be the third. During the other speeches, she tried to breathe deeply and stay focused, but she noticed that Miss Roberts was taking small notes every time she looked in her direction, and that set off a silent alarm bell inside her chest. When it was her turn, Jasmine stood up with her laptop in her hands and walked to the front of the room. Silence was immediate. Unlike her previous classmates who had faced normal distractions, a cough, a whisper, someone fiddling with their backpack, the room seemed to hold its breath when she showed the first slides, took a deep breath and began. Her voice was steady and rhythmic. She spoke about the historical context of the work, about the role of Atticus Finch, about Tom Robinson's wounded innocence, but also about how the story spoke directly to the present. She cited current data, recalled recent events in the United States and Brazil, and wove it all together with a lucidity that few in the room could ignore. Some students began to nod their heads. Others murmured softly, "Wow," in response to phrases that hit the nail on the head. Jasmine wasn't just presenting a paper. She was occupying a space with a presence that was uncomfortable, precisely because it was undeniable. Miss Roberts, sitting behind her desk, crossed her arms and kept a faint smile on her face, the kind of smile that is anything but friendly. As Jasmine finished the main part and thanked her, the teacher slowly stood up and walked to the front of the room. For a moment, the silence grew thicker. She looked at the projection, then at Jasmine, and then began to comment. But she did not talk about the content or the quality of the analysis. She said that the slides were visually busy, that the fonts used were not up to school standards, that the tone of the speech was too rehearsed and that it lacked spontaneity. Then she turned to the class and asked a rhetorical question. Is it fair to distort a literary work to fit it into personal ideological discourses? The blow was sharp, precise. Jasmine felt the ground shake beneath her feet, but she did not respond. She just stared at her, motionless, and in that look there was everything that could not be said out loud. For a few seconds, no one moved. The embarrassment was palpable, almost physical. Some colleagues glanced discreetly at Jasmine, others lowered their eyes to their notebooks as if they had not seen anything. Miss Roberts, satisfied with what seemed to be yet another lesson taught, returned to her desk with the same calm as always. Jasmine, still in front of the room, did not know whether to return to her seat or wait for some formal comment. In the end, she simply closed her notebook carefully, gathered up her papers, and walked silently to her desk. She sat down with calculated movements, trying to maintain her composure. Inside, her body was pulsing. It was not anger, nor sadness. It was something deeper, a mixture of humiliation and lucidity. She knew that it had a name, racism, but said in a polite, technical, elegant way, the kind that many refuse to see because it does not come with insults or shouting. It comes with opinions, with well-structured arguments and the word excellence as a shield. What no one knew, not even Jasmine, was that on that day, in that very class, the school principal had decided to make a surprise visit to watch some presentations. He wanted to observe the students' performance, give feedback to the teaching staff, and, of course, get a first-hand look at how the new students were doing. He'd been sitting at the back of the room since the second presentation began, with the door ajar, watching in silence. When he saw his daughter get up to present, his heart skipped a beat. By choice, their family relationship was kept secret within the school. Jasmine wanted to be evaluated like any other student. He respected that, but nothing prepared him for what he witnessed that morning. The public humiliation, the comments disguised as technical criticism, the use of authority as a weapon, all of it affected him in a way that went beyond the principal's position. It affected his father directly. The principal stood up without making a fuss. He walked slowly to the front of the room, while Miss Roberts continued to leaf through her papers, oblivious to his presence. When he finally noticed the movement, he looked up with a slight start and tried to compose his face into an expression of formal respect. "Principal King, I didn't know you would be here today." He didn't answer right away. He looked at his daughter, who was now staring at him with teary eyes, and then turned his gaze back to the teacher with a firmness that dispensed with any formality. "That's right. I came precisely to monitor the application of the literary content in class, and by chance, I witnessed something much more revealing than I imagined." The class fell completely silent. Some students exchanged discreet glances. Others, more attentive, were already beginning to understand that something serious was about to happen. Miss Roberts tried to keep the tone institutional. "If there is anything in the content that needs to be adjusted, I am completely open to suggestions." The principal interrupted her with a calm but decisive gesture. "The problem is not the content. It is the way it is being used to disguise prejudice. It is the manipulation of academic discourse to delegitimize a student who happens to be my daughter, but who, even if she were not, deserves the same respect and recognition." The mention of the relationship between the two caused the entire room to wake up. A subdued murmur ran through the rows. Miss Roberts paled. Her expression wavered. Between surprise and embarrassment, she tried to stammer something, perhaps an excuse, but the principal continued. "Throughout the presentation, what I saw was a clear attempt to silence a powerful and legitimate voice. That is not rigor. That is institutionalized racism, and as long as I am principal of this school, that will not go unpunished." Miss Roberts looked as if she had been hit in the chest. For the first time, she could not hide her reaction. Her face, once proud and confident, lost control. Her attempt at professionalism now seemed out of place, almost cynical. Principal King, I never meant to offend your daughter. I simply demanded the same level of excellence that I demand of all students. The answer came without hesitation. No, Miss Roberts. What you did was choose who had the right to be heard. You used your position to shape what is considered acceptable within a discussion that, ironically, is precisely about racial injustice. Your selective reading of what excellency says more about your standards than it does about Jasmine's performance. At that moment, the mood in the room was no longer merely tense. There was a kind of quiet liberation, as if suddenly what many had felt but could never name had finally been given a voice. If you also believe that stories like this need to be heard, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel. There are a lot of powerful things coming. Jasmine sat there, not saying a word, but something in her posture had changed. It was no longer defensive, it was firm. Her eyes were fixed, unwavering. Her heart was racing, but not with fear. It was as if someone had finally seen what she had been enduring day after day. Someone with power, yes, but mostly with the courage to call things by their right name. One of the students in the back row hesitantly raised his hand. The principal encouraged him to speak. I've noticed that too, not just with Jasmine. It happens to other students. When someone steps out of line, it seems like everything we say is read as a threat. The principal nodded. Thank you for sharing. That's how things start to change, when we stop pretending not to see. Miss Roberts was no longer responding. She stood still, her eyes fixed on the floor, as if she were suddenly the one who no longer knew what to say. The principal took a deep breath, as if he were holding the weight of years of unresolved issues in seconds. He looked at Miss Roberts one last time, then turned to the class. This school prides itself on its grades, results, and performance, but none of that is worth anything if we can't guarantee the basics. Respect. There is no room here for prejudice disguised as demands, nor for silencing voices that challenge the comfort of some. Starting today, changes will happen, and they start now. Without raising his voice, but with unquestionable authority, he announced that Miss Roberts would be temporarily removed until a full internal evaluation was conducted. Shock filled the room. Some widened their eyes, others whispered among themselves. Jasmine just continued to stare, unblinking. For the first time, she felt that something was being done before it was too late. Miss Roberts did not protest, perhaps because she knew there was nothing more to say, perhaps because she had already understood that silence at that moment would be the only possible way out. She left the room without looking back. The principal remained standing in front of the class for a few moments before thanking everyone for listening and saying that he would speak to the class again soon. Then he turned to his daughter, put his hand on her shoulder, and said, "Just for her, you were brilliant." Jasmine did not respond. She just nodded with teary eyes, and for the first time in that school, she felt whole. When he left, her classmates looked at her with a different kind of attention. Not judgment, nor astonishment. It was as if they were seeing something new, or perhaps seeing better what had always been there, but which they only now knew how to name: strength. In the days that followed, the school seemed different. The incident became the talk of every hallway, snack table, and WhatsApp group. Some teachers avoided commenting, others, younger, showed support with knowing glances or small talk during recess. But among the students, the transformation was more visible. For the first time, many felt encouraged to speak up. Jasmine began to be sought out by classmates who previously barely knew her name. Some just wanted to say thank you. Others wanted to share similar stories. The girl who sat in the last row said she was always afraid of making mistakes because of the tone in which Miss Roberts corrected her. A new student revealed that he almost asked to be transferred because he felt he was never taken seriously. Jasmine listened attentively to everything. She felt a mix of relief and responsibility. It wasn't about her, after all. It was about everyone who, like her, was tired of carrying the weight of silence on their shoulders. The principal kept his promise. The following week, He called a meeting with teachers, coordinators, and students to discuss the creation of a diversity committee. It would not be just a symbolic group, but a real space for listening and action. It was there that the idea of creating the Cultural Awareness Club was born, where students could propose debates, bring films, books, experiences, and stories that reflected their experiences. Jasmine was invited to be one of the coordinators, an invitation she accepted with the same determination with which she faced those first days, but this time with a lighter smile. Little by little, the school stopped being a place where she had to constantly prove that she deserved to be there. It began to become a space where her presence was recognized, valued, and most importantly, heard. And that, for someone who had almost been silenced, was the most important victory of all. Comment below what this part of the story awakened in you. Your opinion can inspire more people to reflect and act. Despite the positive changes, Jasmine did not forget what she had experienced. Not because she wanted to hold a grudge, but because she knew that forgetting would be the first step to repeating it. Sometimes, she still found herself reviewing the presentation slides, wondering what would have happened if her father had not been in that room that day. Would anyone have said anything? Would she have kept trying, or would she, like many before her, simply kept quiet? These questions came not with bitterness, but with clarity. Jasmine understood that the episode had been a turning point not only in school, but in herself. It was no longer about proving that she was smart, capable, prepared. She already knew that. Now her challenge was to use everything she had learned to pave the way for others. Because if there is one thing she learned too early, it is that being alone in difficult spaces should not be normal. At the club's first official meeting, Jasmine told her story, not in a tone of denunciation, but as a report of experience. She spoke calmly, but without sugarcoating the facts. When she finished, the room gave a standing ovation. It wasn't that exaggerated, automatic applause. It was a silent gesture of recognition, as if everyone there understood that they were witnessing something deeper than a pretty speech. Later, other students began to share their stories as well. An indigenous girl talked about the looks she received every time she wore earrings made by her grandmother. A Muslim boy told about the day they asked if his religion allowed him to be normal. It was as if, for the first time, the school was listening, for real. Jasmine listened, took notes, welcomed them. She felt that now her presence had become something that made a difference, and without realizing it, she had become a reference. Over time, even teachers began to reach out to her, not with prepared speeches or apologies, but with real questions. What do you think we can change about the way we teach? How can we make sure this doesn't happen again? Jasmine, who had always been able to articulate ideas easily, now spoke with more confidence, without the burden of having to defend herself with every sentence. She knew she couldn't change everything at once, and she also knew that not everyone was willing to listen. But if at least some of them were, then it was a start. A history teacher who had previously been distant began recommending books by Black authors. A biology teacher invited a community doctor to speak about Black women's health. These were small but consistent gestures. For Jasmine, it was like watching the cracks in the walls being filled, not with white paint to disguise them, but with new structures. At home, her father maintained his usual demeanor, discreet, firm, but now with a different outlook. Sometimes at dinner, he would proudly comment on the progress that was being made, but he never put Jasmine in the center as the principal's daughter. For him, she was responsible for all of that, not because of the blood tie, but because of her courage. At one of those dinners, he said something that she never forgot. "You taught me that silence is also a choice, and that sometimes you have to speak even when no one wants to listen." Jasmine was silent for a few seconds, then smiled. She didn't need to say anything. That was enough. The wound that started in that classroom still hurt from time to time, but now it had become a scar, the kind that can't be hidden, but that tells a story worth remembering. The Cultural Awareness Club grew quickly. In less than 2 months, they had organized 2 school-wide discussion groups, a campaign against microaggressions, and a mural with quotes from marginalized authors. The hallways of St. Clair, previously adorned only with Olympic medals and portraits of famous alumni, now also displayed photos of the meetings, colorful handmade posters, and a different energy in the air. What had previously seemed like an untouchable place, where everything was already set in stone, began to become an environment under construction, and this gave new meaning to the word excellence. Jasmine was not the only protagonist of this change, but she was the most remembered face. Not out of vanity, but because she had been the first to break the mold, the first to stand up to it, the first to not lower her eyes. One day, while she was organizing books for the next meeting, a first grader approached her. She was shy, wore long braids, and spoke softly. "I wanted to join the club, it's just, I never talked much in school, but when I saw you talking like that, I wanted to try." Jasmine stopped what she was doing and looked the girl straight in the eyes. "You don't have to be loud, you just have to not let anyone silence you." The girl smiled, as if she had been given a secret password. For Jasmine, that was more powerful than any trophy, grade, or diploma. It was proof that when one person refuses to be silenced, they give permission for many others to find their own voice. And that changed everything, because courage is also contagious. And in that moment, she knew the change that began with pain was now becoming a legacy. The changes didn't stop at the club. In pedagogical meetings, teachers began to review assessment criteria, reflect on the language used in class, and even rethink the books assigned to each subject. For the first time, active listening was on the agenda. The principal proposed mandatory training on diversity and equity. The school board created an anonymous channel for reporting discrimination. Some measures faced resistance, of course. Some said it was all exaggeration, or that they were politicizing the school. But most understood that it wasn't about dividing, but about inclusion, about making room for everyone to exist with dignity within the same institution. Jasmine followed everything with a grain of salt, but with hope. She knew that real change took time, and despite all the achievements, she remained vigilant. Because those who have been silenced learn early on to identify when the noise once again masks the old silence. At an official school event months later, Jasmine was called to the stage to receive an award. The name of the ceremony was Voices That Inspire. She hesitated before accepting. She didn't like the idea of being celebrated just for having faced something that should never have happened. But she also understood that space, until then reserved for names that never resembled hers, could now be filled with other meanings. She walked up to the stage with firm steps and attentive eyes. When she received the plaque, she looked at the students in the audience, at the teachers, at her father sitting in the front row. And in that moment, she felt that, despite the pain she had experienced, something inside her had changed forever. It wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who came before, and about everyone who was yet to come. Because on that stage, what was being honored was not just her courage, it was the possibility of a new beginning. Over time, Jasmine learned to live with the title the school gave her, but she never let it define who she was. She continued to study hard, joined the club, kept the same group of friends, and still faced the odd look here and there. The difference was that now she knew when those looks were trying to put her down, and more importantly, she knew she didn't have to accept them. Some people really did change. Others just learned to hide it better. But Jasmine no longer wore herself out trying to please or fit in. She understood that her presence, just the way she was already an act of resistance. It was no longer about being accepted. It was about taking up space, building bridges, opening doors for others like her. The school had changed, yes, but she had changed even more. There were days when she thought about all the things that could have been different, if Miss Roberts had acted differently, if one of the students had spoken up sooner, if her father hadn't been there, but she quickly pushed those thoughts away because she understood that living in what-ifs was like walking in circles in a dark room. What mattered was what she did with it. All, and she did a lot. She didn't let the experience harden her insides or let her resentment turn into cynicism. She continued to believe that school could still be a place of transformation, and more than that, she helped make it exactly that. Not by miracle, not by luck, but by choice. A difficult but necessary choice to speak up, even when everything around her was telling her to keep quiet. To this day, Jasmine remembers that day with a mixture of pain and strength. Sometimes, the smell of marker on the board, or the sound of the projector turning on transports her back to room 202. But instead of reliving just the embarrassment, she remembers the moment her father stood up. She remembers the courage to speak the truth out loud. She remembers the classmate who shyly spoke about how he also felt left out. She remembers the girl with the braids who wanted to join the club. These are the memories she chooses to carry, not to forget what she suffered, but to remind herself how important it is to not bend, not even when everything around her tries to bend you. She knows that other classrooms like that still exist, that other Miss Roberts still walk unpunished down hallways with white walls and honor rolls. But she also knows that there are other Jasmines. In all parts of the country, in schools big and small, there are smart, creative black girls who just need a chance to be heard. And if she, with her voice, was able to make a space in a place where no one expected anything from her, then so can they. Jasmine understands that the power of change doesn't always come from grand gestures. Sometimes it starts with a raised hand, a stopped idea, and a simple choice to keep speaking up, even when they try to shut you down. At her high school graduation, Jasmine took the stage as the class speaker. The invitation came from her own classmates. She hesitated before accepting, as she did every time she received recognition. But she understood that this moment was not just for her. She took the microphone, took a deep breath, and began by thanking everyone, not only for the teachers who really taught her, but for the classmates who had the courage to look around and see the other person. She said, in no uncertain terms, that the school had been the scene of deep pain, but also of reconstruction. She spoke about listening, empathy, and responsibility. And she ended with a simple sentence: we can't change the whole world at once, but we can change one classroom, and that's a start. After the speech, several students came up to hug her. Many, who had never approached her before, thanked her in a low voice. Others apologized, not for their direct actions, but for having remained silent. Jasmine welcomed them calmly. She knew that guilt doesn't move anyone. What moves is the choice to do things differently from then on. Later, in the courtyard, her father was waiting for her with a look that said it all. There were no big words, just a long hug, the kind that says, I saw you, without needing anything else. It was then that Jasmine knew for sure that story, which had almost silenced her, ended up being the foundation of the woman she was becoming. Today, now out of school, Jasmine continues to study, work, and speak. Sometimes she is invited to youth events. Other times she just hears stories similar to hers in small groups. And every time she feels that someone is about to shut up, she reaches out, just like someone once did for her, because she understood once and for all that courage is not speaking without fear. It is speaking in spite of it. And that transforming a school, a system, or a way of thinking almost always begins with a very simple choice: not to bow your head. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and activate the bell so you don't miss the next stories that will make you feel and think.